Welcome back to Uptime.com and to our video on best practices for the transaction check. Begin by clicking Monitoring, then Transaction from your user panel to view and add transaction checks specifically. You can also select Monitoring and then Checks to view all checks. If you are adding a new check from the main checks page, you can select the transaction check from the drop-down menu. The Transaction Check script editor allows you to create scripts to mimic user actions and monitor steps. To learn the basics of the transaction check and the recorder, check out our videos and support documentation linked below. Steps are built out using a series of commands and validators, either manually using your developer tools or with our no-code approach using the transaction recorder. Commands are action steps such as click an element, set variable, or go to URL, while validation options look for things like elements to contain text, for elements to exist or not exist, or for specific status codes to be returned, such as 200 OK. A successful and accurate transaction check will use both commands and validators to ensure the site is working as expected. Before we get into best practices for configuring a check, which is a balance between commands and validations, let's cover some basics about the structure of the check itself. Steps are combined to build a full script for the check. The transaction check supports a total script time of 60 seconds, allowing approximately 1.2 seconds automatically between navigation steps. So our first best practice is to keep checks as streamlined as possible to avoid global timeout errors. To manage this, it's best to keep the check script to one process. Example, one check tests a login process, and a second check validates a payment process. Rather than including a navigation step to a login page, begin the check on that login page itself. Then enter credentials, submit the login form, and validate the landing page. For checks verifying more than one process, try navigating directly between each process with the fewest possible click steps. The other best practice related to time are the wait for commands. Some common steps in any transaction check are wait for element to exist or to contain text, which helps to ensure the element has loaded before a click action, or a fill-in field command. You will see in the commands menu also a wait for 1 second option. The difference between these two command types has to do with JavaScript. Using the command wait for element to exist only waits for the element itself, not for the JavaScript to complete, whereas adding wait for 1 second will allow additional time for JavaScript to load. Keep in mind, it also adds an additional second to the overall script time of 60 seconds for the check. To cover some other best practices, let's set up a simple 7-step check to validate the Uptime.com domain health tool. Step 1 is go to URL. The go to URL command will follow up to 20 redirects. If you are using the Uptime.com transaction recorder, you must use a URL that begins with HTTPS. Step 2 is the wait for element to exist command. Validation does not wait long for elements to load, so adding a step to wait for this element to exist increases the stability of your check. Step 3 fills in a field with our domain. Use test credentials when possible for security. It's also important to know that transaction checks will mimic user actions exactly as they are configured. If you are testing a form submission or a payment process using a dummy credit card, make sure the processes you are testing are not third-party solutions that charge per submission. Step 4 is where we submit our form. When selecting buttons and other elements using tags, a mistake we sometimes see, particularly with manual configurations, is selecting the wrong div tag instead of the actual button itself. This also brings us to our best practice of making sure you are testing your transactions both with your dev and production sites, and managing the labeling of elements so that the transaction check can successfully locate them. Step 5 is that we validate our URL on our landing page contains the correct text. Validating a URL is a great way to ensure that your previous navigation step has transported you to the correct page. Keep in mind that validating the URL does not validate the elements on the page itself, so we're going to add 2 last validation steps in steps 6 and 7. Step 6 will wait for the element to exist, and step 7 will wait for a specific element to contain text. Adding a few final validation steps, if your check script is not overly long, makes sense, especially if you are wanting to validate both that the page has loaded, but also that all of the important information is visible to the end user. When you are satisfied with your script, make sure you've selected the locations from which your check will monitor, added any tags for organization, confirmed your contact alert for notifications, and selected the interval for continuous monitoring. The transaction check can be configured at intervals ranging from 5 to 60 minutes. Keep in mind that the check will run from all of your configured locations consecutively within the interval that you set. If you have 5 locations configured for a 5-minute interval, you will get approximately 1 minute monitoring coverage for your transaction check. To activate, click Save. To learn more about our best practices for advanced settings, escalations, and maintenance, check out our advanced settings video and support documentation linked in the description below. This completes our coverage of transaction check best practices. For more information, check out our video library or reach out to us directly at support@uptime.com.